I want to thank all my colleagues from both sides of the aisle and all the folks joining us for taking part in this conversation about getting aid to our local governments who are grappling with the COVID-19 pandemic. Counties, cities, townships, villages, whatever they're called in different states all around this country. You know, I talk every day with different leaders in the 21 communities in my district. One mayor in the district read scripture of Clausen summed up how this pandemic is impacting communities like hers, which is a city of 12,000 people. She said, "We're used to doing less or more with less, but this is going to devastate us." Local leaders are working around the clock to acquire tests and protection for first responders, to help their hospitals and schools, and so much more. The least we could do is make sure they have the resources necessary to keep this essential work going. That's what our Coronavirus Community Relief Act is all about. It provides $250 billion in relief for localities with populations of 500,000 or less. Plus, it provides a lot of flexibility for them so they can use the money as necessary to deal with this crisis. Today, we'll talk about why this relief is so important. I'll turn it over to the other members for some brief opening remarks, and then we're going to hear from some experts before we begin our discussion. Thanks again for being here, and now I'd like to turn it over to our great assistant speaker, Ben Ray Lujan from New Mexico.
Well, thank you, Mr. Levin, for organizing this forum to discuss the importance of providing assistance to our local governments. And a special thank you to our witnesses today, Mr. Cormier and Mayor Donker, for joining us to share your perspectives. Finally, let me say thank you to all of our colleagues for their advocacy on this important issue. A few weeks ago, a handful of us joined together to introduce the Coronavirus Community Relief Act to provide $250 billion in assistance to the local communities, cities, and towns that are on the front line of this crisis. That bill now has 144 bipartisan co-sponsors and growing. And I'll note that we have members from both sides of the aisle participating in this forum today. Why? Because protecting the paychecks of our police, firefighters, and teachers isn't a partisan issue. It's common sense. In every corner of this country, healthcare workers, home care providers, and emergency medical technicians are doing everything they can to keep our communities healthy. It's not partisan to stand up for them. It's common sense. Correction officers, sanitation workers, and other public service workers continue to serve their communities. Doing right by them isn't partisan. It's necessary. Right now, local governments are taking extraordinary measures to combat this pandemic. Let me quote a letter signed by the National League of Cities, the National Association of Counties, and the United States Conference of Mayors. And I quote, "At the local level, the battle to contain COVID-19 is crisis management beyond anything in recent memory. Both counties and cities are expending an unprecedented amount of resources while losing historic amounts of revenue. And for most communities, the peak of the pandemic has yet to be reached. All local governments, regardless of population, urgently need direct federal funding to help us continue to fight COVID-19 and protect our residents through the summer and beyond," close quote. Failing to provide meaningful and robust relief to our local governments would significantly undermine our response to the coronavirus. Let's act to provide relief to our local governments, and let's show the same urgency as the public service workers that are doing everything they can to save lives. And with that, Andy, I yield back.
Thank you so much, Ben Ray. And now I'd like to turn it over to our great colleague from New Jersey, Tom Malinowski. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman Levin. Thank you, Congressman Lujan. It's great that we're doing this. It's great that we've figured out a way to do a congressional hearing that Rodney Davis can drive to in his car. So that's fun. I want him to turn on his camera. And I'm really glad that we've come together across party lines to do this. Look, we're not at this hearing talking about the kind of issue that usually divides Republicans and Democrats. All of us agree that local government in America has to continue to function. And all of us want to see local government weather this storm. I come from a district in New Jersey that has 75 communities in it. Not a single one has a population over 50,000. Some of them have a lot of COVID-19 cases. Some of them have a lot fewer, but they are all equally affected by the economic shutdown. They are all equally affected by the loss of revenue that is caused by what we have, this coma that we have induced in the American economy to get us out of the public health crisis. Last week, 54 of the mayors and county elected officials in my district, Republicans and Democrats, signed a letter to the congressional leadership urging us to pass this bill that we all support, urging us to provide relief to state and local governments. I've heard from all kinds of individual mayors in my district. One of them told me a few days ago that she is already planning to cut the purchase of radios for her police force, cutting equipment for the fire department and the sewer department. I've heard from county officials and school boards already thinking about whether significant layoffs to teachers and first responders are going to be necessary if this shortfall of revenue continues. And you know, it's not just stuff that we put in the same category as teachers and cops. I got a note from the mayor of Phillipsburg, New Jersey, a town in my district. It's got about 14,000 people in it. And he wrote to me, not opening the municipal pool, golf courses, campgrounds, canceling summer sports, day camps, concerts, festivals, fairs, and carnivals leads to a sense of depression that is felt all over town. These are the things that small town America does, that we all count on. And none of this is their fault. None of this is the fault of mismanagement. All of them have to balance their budgets. This is a natural disaster. So I'm glad that we're coming together. I'm glad that there is broader acknowledgement, I think, today that we need to do something about local government funding in our next bill, including from Leader McConnell in the Senate. Let's keep politics out of this. I know there are probably policies that my state of New Jersey pursues that people in other parts of the country dislike. There are things that happen in Texas and Alabama that I would not choose if I were a citizen of those states, but this is not a time to condition relief, disaster assistance on stuff that may trigger us in a partisan way. We are all Americans. We have to come together and help each other, just as we have done for small businesses. We have to save small town America. So I'm so glad to be part of this effort with you and looking forward to the witness testimony.
Thanks, Tom. And now I'd like to call on the person who's actually the principal author of the Coronavirus Community Relief Act, and who does look pretty good, if I might say so myself, Representative Joe Neguse from Colorado. Joe, you've got the floor for 2 minutes.
Well, thank you, Representative Levin. And while I might be the original author, the truth of the matter is this has been a team effort from the start. And I'm very grateful to my colleagues, to Andy, to, of course, our Assistant Speaker for his leadership, and to my wonderful friend from New Jersey, Mr. Malinowski, and our Republican colleagues as well for joining us today. It's great to see you. And I want to echo the sentiments of my colleagues that it has been heartening for me to have such bipartisan strong support for the Coronavirus Community Relief Act, and for this bipartisan consensus to have emerged that our rural towns, that our small cities, that our suburban areas and across the country ought to be taken care of, and that ultimately these areas ought to be able to obtain the same financial relief that our larger counterparts, the big cities, have received in prior iterations of the funding that we've approved at the federal level to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic. My district, like many of the districts of my colleagues, includes many counties and many cities with a population of under 500,000. And yet some of those same counties and cities have been the hardest hit by both the public health crisis and the economic crisis that has followed. To give you an example, Vail, Colorado, many of you who are watching and listening may have traveled to Vail in the past, a world-class ski destination area, a wonderful community with wonderful people. The town actually at one point had the highest per capita COVID-19 infection rate here in our state of Colorado. And yet The population of the town is a little bit over 5,000 people. Eagle County, where Vail is located, has a population of over 50,000 people. These communities deserve just as much as their larger counterparts to have access to stabilization funds at the federal level to help them deal with the economic crisis that they have experienced as they do everything they can to protect their citizens and to keep our communities healthy and safe. Gilpin County, a small county with a population of less than 10,000 people, according to the Wall Street Journal, happens to be the ranked #1 county in the United States that has been the hardest hit economically due to the public health emergency and the challenges presented by COVID-19. So behind these statistics are real people, real communities, critical public services like police and firefighters and others, EMT, first responders. It is crucial that the Congress step up to the plate as we work through negotiations on a potential fifth stimulus package, that local governments not be left behind. And that's why I'm so excited to have around 150, I believe now, of our colleagues supporting this effort, including the wonderful members that have gathered today. And I'm so grateful to the activism and the advocacy from our local leaders, including the witnesses who joined us today, who have made clear their priorities and why this issue is so important to them and our shared constituencies. With that, I'll yield back.
Thank you, Joe. And now I would like to hear from my neighbor to the south, who, you know, played for a football team that isn't my favorite, but I love him all the more for it. Representative Anthony Gonzalez.
I changed.
Yours.
I changed shirts specifically not to taunt over the Zoom.
Look, I'm kind of wearing yours. So.
I had an Ohio State shirt on, but in any event, well, thank you for pulling this together. Thank you to all my colleagues, and a big thank you to all the witnesses, of course. Look, it's been said a million times, we are in uncharted territory. But one thing that continues to give me optimism is that largely it has been the case that a normally partisan body that has been hard pressed to get big things done for the American people has come together in very important ways over the last few months. And I think we should be proud in many instances of the work that we've done, but we all know that it's not over. We've done good work on the public health side. We need to continue to do great work to develop treatments and diagnostics and get a better handle on our data so that can inform how we rebuild our countries. But we've also done a good job providing liquidity to small businesses, to Main Street America, and to individual families through stimulus checks. What has been a serious gap since day one is the funding for local governments. Our local governments in my community in Ohio's 16th district, and I know around the country for my colleagues, look, we're well run, we're fiscally sound part of the country, but the reality is our tax bases have been devastated by this crisis, and there hasn't been relief to our first responders, to our firefighters, to our police officers, and to our local communities who are fighting this on the front lines. The biggest outbreaks in the most populous county in my district, Cuyahoga, which is where Cleveland is, are North Royalton and Strongsville, two cities in my district, neither of which have qualified for any of the funding to date. And so at a time when stress is at an all-time high, revenues are falling off a cliff, and we're taxing our police officers and our firefighters, not fiscally taxing, but taxing with respect to the responsibilities that they have, I believe this is something that we all need to rally behind, and we need to do so in a bipartisan way. And so I'm thrilled that we're all here in agreement on that. Are we all going to get everything we want? No, of course not. It's Congress, that's how it works. But the fact that I think we're here and we're showing such a strong bipartisan effort, I hope will inform the dialogue as we move forward and we work on our next package. I know everybody on this call is committed to that. I'm thrilled to be on it, and I just want to thank everybody, both our witnesses and the other members, for your leadership on this very important issue, and I yield back.
Thank you so much, Anthony. And I think I've heard that our colleague Steve Stivers had a last-minute conflict, so he may not be able to join us. So I'd like to turn it over to my good friend, Representative Rodney Davis, who is joining us mobily. I love it. This is a first for me, Rodney. So the floor is yours.
Hey man, you know, we got to multitask, and when my wife says go to the grocery store, calls and hearings, they don't matter. I have to fit it all in. That's why when Malinowski was taunting me to get it back on the video, I couldn't. I was masked up, and I was at our local grocery store, adding to our local sales tax base, mind you, to make sure that I got my wife's stuff done. I timed it just right to where I could be the passenger in the car on the way home. So, hey, this is a great day for all of us to highlight the bipartisanship that exists in Washington, and the legislation we're talking about today, and the efforts that you, Mr. Levin, and my other colleagues have been pushing. It's something that I think doesn't get enough attention in Washington about where we work together. The good news is we have come together in a bipartisan fashion already with two pots of money for our PPP program, our Paycheck Protection Act program, that is going to allow for our local economies to still recover. Because if we were not able to focus on those small businesses who've never asked for government assistance before, if we were not able to give them the bridge funding necessary to be able to survive this virus and survive this emergency, then there wouldn't be a long-term local sales tax base that our local communities were used to just a few short weeks ago. So we did the right first step. Now's the time to start looking at how do we spend dollars more wisely in the future. I was under the impression, I know many of my colleagues were, that just because we told the states that you weren't going to be able to give out funds to directly aid communities due to coronavirus spending unless you're 500,000 or above, it did not preclude states from sending dollars to our local communities to fight those same costs with the billions that they're getting. And what that tells me is maybe we have to put in place a few more restrictions on how those dollars get to our local communities to help our firefighters, our police officers, our teachers, just like it's been said. I have some ideas. I'm interested to hear what our local officials think would work. I kind of come from the old school thought that if we already have programs authorized, let's find a way to work through those existing programs to get a better sense of how we get these dollars directly to our local communities, because it certainly didn't work out the way I thought it was going to with the first package. But thank you, Andy. Thanks, everyone. Joe, you look good. Even you, Malinowski. Hey, thanks, everyone. I look forward to hearing the witnesses speak and look forward to their testimony. And I look forward to harassing Gonzalez after this is over.
All right. Thanks so much, Rodney. I'm absolutely in the same boat as you. What I got to do today is get the snow tires off and the regular tires on. So I'm right there with you. Appreciate it. All right. So now let's hear from our witnesses who they're really the reason that we're here today. You know, the effect of this crisis on counties and cities has been so tremendous. And we've got one leader representing counties and one leader representing cities. First, I'd like to introduce Guy Cormier, who's the executive director for the Police Jury Association in Louisiana and a leader in the National Association of Counties. And we've really worked hand in glove with our national groups of counties and cities to try to craft this bill in the way that would be most effective for our local governments. So, Mr. Cormier, the floor is yours for 5 minutes. Welcome, and thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you so much. Well, first off, good afternoon, Representatives Lujan, Malachowski, Representatives Levin. This is not Louisiana names, by the way. Gonzalez, Davis, and Stivers, and Representative Magoo. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here with you, just to talk about the Community Relief Act that you are more specifically the need for direct and flexible funding that you are trying to give to local governments. We really appreciate that. My name is Guy Cormier. I am the Executive Director of the Police Jury Association. In Louisiana, we have parishes, not counties. But prior to me being the Executive Director of the Police Jury Association, I actually was the chief elected official in one of the parishes in Louisiana. I served 20 years in local government, so I have worn the same hat you've worn as being an elected position, but have had to make those tough budget cuts and in those trying times. And these times are just amazing to me for us to have to go through a pandemic. Never in a million years that I think I would see it. But at the end of the day, that's what it is. I also represent the National Association of Counties, made up of 3,069 parishes, counties, and boroughs. So in Alaska, they call them boroughs. In Louisiana, we call them parishes. And in the rest of the country, we call them counties. To begin with, I'd like to thank you for your leadership in the bipartisan effort and all the things you've done so far. You've talked about a lot of good things that have been very, very welcome to our businesses and to our residents who make up Louisiana and the nation as a whole. And I know that this was a bipartisan effort thus far. All these packages have come out. And as we move toward recovery, further strengthening intergovernmental relationships and partners, I just want you to know that parishes and counties, we serve as ground zero for this pandemic. Counties and parishes nationwide are involved in every aspect of COVID-19. When an individual gets COVID-19 and needs assistance, they call 911. Local government takes care of that. One of our local dispatchers takes the call. 9 out of 10, they're going to dispatch a parish emergency or a county emergency person to go out to pick that person up. Probably going to bring them to or near the 1,000 county and parish-run hospitals that we have in America. And so a lot of that is all falling on us. Of course, the most at-risk populations tend to be our elderly. We do have 800 county-run long-term facilities that we try to keep safe every day. We are also working to implement safe social distancing practices in our county jails, which has been quite a challenge for us. But while we're doing that, we're sending police and fire departments out to handle community efforts every day, going into areas that may or may not have COVID-19 prevalent in them. Meanwhile, one of our 1,900 local public health units that we have throughout America are dealing with this. We're doing testing, we're doing scanning, we're doing tracing, and so it affects us from that perspective as well. Our local human services departments are working with many families that have to leave children behind. We have to place those children into foster care. That is all fallen on local governments to be able to handle that. Of course, just like everything else, we are expanding operations to get assistance on all sorts of ways to help these people. And we lobby every day. We lobby you guys to be able to give those folks assistance when it comes to, things that they need to be able to survive this pandemic. And unfortunately, issues in instances where individuals pass away, the county coroner has to deal with it. And so we've seen a rising cost and a rising strain on those county offices and the resources that are available to them to be able to just handle this pandemic. These are all new duties to us. We're not used to dealing with that. I'll tell you, I've done my years in local government, and this is the first time we've ever had to do something like this. This is particularly true in my state. As of right now, we have 29,000 confirmed cases. We are one of the nation's hotspots. We climbed all the way up to number 3. We're currently sitting at number 6 as far as being a hotspot. But we've buried over 2,000 people, or right around 2,000 people due to COVID-19 deaths. This number's fastly growing, and it continues to grow at a rapid rate, and probably going to surpass one of our most devastating issues here in Louisiana, Hurricane Katrina. But at the end of the day, we've considered one of those top states, and because of that, we are working every day, busting our tails to make sure that we can provide what we need for the citizens, whether it be whatever it is, at our expense, by the way. Beyond our normal day-to-day activities, we got to take care of a lot of other things. And so we are on the front lines when it comes to this pandemic. Our nurses and our physicians who are county paid are working 7 days a week, round the clock, trying to get things done. We're setting up field hospitals in my state to be able to keep those patients that test positive away from the normal patients or patients that do not or have not tested COVID, but may be in the hospital for something else. At the same time, our county hospitals and our parish hospitals are taking it on the chin. We are not being able to have any kind of surgeries done because all of our hospitals have been COVID-related hospitals. And so we're feeling the effects of that happening. And as we tackle all these new challenges, we're seeing a lot of decreases in our economic downturn because of loss of sales tax revenues. In fact, NACO has some statistics and some research that show that we project that $144 billion, it'll be $144 billion budget impact to counties and parishes and boroughs throughout the United States. $114 billion of that being for loss of revenue. Small counties with fewer than 50,000 residents face the same difficult financial challenges as the ones with 500,000. This is particularly true in Louisiana, where most parish taxes revenues are down more than 50%. Ultimately, first, it's forcing our local governments to be able to furlough their employees and in some cases lay them off. We haven't seen this since Hurricane Katrina, and so it's been quite an impact on us. This tremendous loss of revenue and increase in costs may ultimately result in cuts that we have to just make to our everyday job that we have to do, and we don't want to do that. In order for us to maintain and mandate balanced budgets, many counties and parishes are forced to cut, just like I said, things that we normally wouldn't. On average, these counties have furloughed about 6% of their population, their county population. And this brings me to the reason why we're here today. In the midst of this crisis, a strong federal, state, and local partnership we should be able to find that somewhere, including direct funding to counties and parishes of all sizes because of lost revenue, not just the big ones. It is of most importance that we combat COVID-19 to save as many lives as possible. The CARES Act provided some funding. I think one of you guys said it. It provided funding to the states, but that funding was not for loss of revenue. And so we're just excited about the ability that you have in your bill being a great first step towards providing the much needed relief that we need to cover revenues lost because of COVID-19. Moving forward, in my closing, as Congress considers this next COVID-19 response package, we, counties and parishes across the county, urge our federal partners to work in a bipartisan effort. This affects independents, Republicans, and Democrats to provide the direct and flexible funding that we need, so that, because it's not just one size fits all. We are all going through this at this particular time. In closing, let me just thank you for this discussion today. And as I mentioned, the lost revenue piece continues to be the critical piece that we need for us to be able to move ourselves forward and to be able to assist you from a federal perspective, because we are the government that's the closest to the people. And so we want to just continue to do our work, but to do it, we need your help. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Cormier. And, you know, your testimony to me reflected in Michigan, we have 83 counties, as we call them here. 79 of the 83 are under 500,000 people. So the aid that we gave in the CARES Act that could go to states and then to jurisdictions with 500,000 or more, you know, 79 out of our 83 counties aren't included in that.
Well, in Louisiana, all 64 parishes were not included because we don't have any city or county or parish that has a population of 500,000. So we got zero.
There you go. So thank you so much. And now we're going to hear from Mayor Maureen Donker of Midland, Michigan, my home state. So I'm especially proud to have her. And she is representing as well the National League of Cities. Mayor Donker, please go ahead for up to 5 minutes of testimony. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Congressman Levin and members who are present here today for today's forum. I am Maureen Donker. I'm the mayor of Midland, Michigan. Midland is a city that's located in central Michigan. We have just over a population of just over 41,000. And with me today is our city manager, Mr. Brad Kay. And I asked him especially to be here today because of our form of government, which is a council manager form of government. And it's important that as we're addressing you, that we make sure that we help you get any answers to your questions that you might need. And therefore, he's agreed to be here with me today. So I want to thank you all for allowing me to be here on behalf of my city and on behalf of the National League of Cities. The National League of Cities is the nation's largest and most respected membership and advocacy organization for city leaders, comprised of more than 19,000 cities, towns, and villages, representing more than 218 million Americans. The cities and towns in each of your congressional districts very likely are members of the NLC. I appreciate the opportunity to provide the perspective of local government impacted by COVID-19 and the necessary pause in economic activity required to flatten the curve. Midland is an extraordinary place to live. We share traits that are common among hardworking Midwestern cities. We pride ourselves in being a resilient and self-reliant community where residents are quick to help one another in times of trouble. But there are times when communities such as ours face challenges beyond our means, and this is one of them. Our residents act responsibly. They pay their taxes on time, and they correctly expect good and uninterrupted services from City Hall. I'd like to tell you a little bit about some of the community-wide impacts that we are seeing as a result of COVID-19. Our Center for the Arts closed. Typically, the center generates $14.5 million of annual economic impact for our community. However, without that closure, that impact disappears. Recently, the city invested $8 million in revitalizing a now largely shuttered downtown district. A new downtown plaza meant for community gatherings sits unfinished, and the redevelopment of a former industrial facility along our downtown riverfront sits idle, and the community investment in it is now uncertain. On top of this, many of our businesses downtown are suffering financially due to the necessary protective closures. We had high hopes for these new investments, but we're now worried about how COVID-19 is going to affect our downtown's future vitality. Last year, the Dow Great Lakes Bay Invitational LPGA event attracted 35,000 visitors in its first year, providing an economic boom for Midland. However, with the LPGA events on hold, there is high likelihood that that too will be canceled this year, and the anticipated economic benefits it would have had will be lost. And finally, Midland's Down Diamond, which is the home of the Great Lakes Loons, a Class A affiliate of the Los Angeles Dodgers, their season's in jeopardy. This community gem is another driver of economic activity in Midland, creating an annual economic impact of $24 million. If there is no baseball this summer, much of that economic impact too will be lost for Midland. Our residents are no less responsible today than they were before the crisis. Our local government is no less responsible today than we were before the crisis. But our city stands to suffer greatly from these and other consequences of COVID-19 pandemic and shutdown. It doesn't matter that prior to this crisis, we were right on track. It's unreasonable to expect that any local government could weather a steep, immediate, and unexpected drop in revenue, such as we are experiencing today, without any assistance from our federal government. But I'd like to take a minute to counter a narrative that has been expressed by some about how local governments handle their budgets. Some have said that we are not financially responsible, that we should be required to stand on our own without any federal assistance, or even that we should be allowed to fail financially if we can't figure this out on our own. This narrative is misguided when it comes to the overwhelming majority of NLC cities and members. To illustrate this, I want to tell you a little bit about Midland and how we run ourselves. Midland has always been a strong, effective steward of the financial resources entrusted to us by our residents. Whenever we are fortunate enough to have any extra money come our way, we allocate it to our highest priority projects, or more often than not, we set it aside into reserve funds established to allow us to save towards projects that we could not otherwise achieve. In other words, we're always thoughtful and forward-looking with our city finances. We plan and we budget within our means, and we set aside money for rainy days. And the rainy days that we envision include things like floods, individual business closures, and swings in our state and local economy. However, no matter how careful we have been, and no matter how much we have planned, we could never have envisioned an economic impact that COVID-19 and the subsequent responses necessary to mitigate its impact could have had on us or cities like us across Michigan and across the nation. Even though we may be in better fiscal position than many of our fellow cities, we are still feeling the effects of the virus on our operations and on our budgets. And although we'll survive without federal assistance, many towns will not. But survival is not and should not be the objective for local governments. We want to be in a position to come out of this crisis and to help our residents recover and thrive. Unfortunately, the Coronavirus Relief Fund that in the CARES Act only provided direct allocations to 36 cities in the nation. The Coronavirus Community Relief Act we are discussing today would significantly help to alleviate the economic shock by providing direct relief funds to my community and the more than 19,000 other communities across the country who have not received relief and are experiencing the same economic devastation and uncertainty. Without the budget certainty and stability that the Coronavirus Community Relief Act could provide, Midland will have no choice but to contemplate cuts in services and employment that would have been unimaginable just a few weeks ago. Critical infrastructure projects needed to protect our residents are likely to be delayed, and funding for new amenities that would improve the quality of life and allow people to not just survive but to flourish would be in jeopardy. The Coronavirus Community Relief Act is a great step forward in providing funds to smaller communities such as mine who are suffering equally under the weight of the virus. On behalf of my city and on the National League of Cities, I want to thank the members of Congress present for this important forum for creating a platform for small cities and towns to tell our story. Please let us know how we can help, and thank you very much for having us here.
Thank you so much, Mayor Donker. That was super helpful. And now we'll go to questions. So each member will have 4 minutes to ask questions. And for you witnesses, that includes their questions and your answers. So I've decided without consulting Austin to bring in this Tibetan water bowl. And at 4 minutes, I'll do something that'll sound a little like this. Well, it'll sound better because I won't be holding it. Okay, and so that'll mean it's time for that member to wrap up, or if a witness is answering their questions, for the witness to wrap up. And I've been really moved by the bipartisanship of this, so I decided to change things. I'm going to go last, and I'm going to ask my colleague from Ohio, Anthony Gonzalez, to go first. Then we'll go to Representative Lujan, and then to Representative Malinowski. No, then to Representative Davis, and then Representative Malinowski, and then Nagus, and then me. So Representative Gonzalez, you have the floor for 4 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, and thank you to our witnesses for your testimonies. That was incredibly helpful, and it certainly mirrors what I'm hearing back in my district, which is, a lot of pain and a lot of difficulty for our local governments. Mayor Donker, I'd like to start with you, if I could. Could you talk specifically about how the city has been forced to deal with the virus on the ground, and then what effect that has also had with respect to prioritizing resources and those sorts of items?
Sure. So some of the things that we've had to do to address this is one, let me just start out with the city itself as it relates to our civic arena is closed, our library is closed, our recreation programs are closed. We've seen a lot of construction activities around the community. Those are closed, including our inspection services, and then industrial investments in our industrial park, those are stopped. We have furloughed 128 employees, which is 28% of our workforce. So as a community, we work very well and very collaboratively together. We have brought together a team that meets weekly to make sure that everyone is informed of what's going on and what everyone is doing. So we are all on the same page, rowing in the same direction, because that's really important to us certainly as a community. And we have had, I think sometimes, you know, out of a tragedy, you also see some incredibly wonderful things happening. And we have seen that in our community from our citizens, and I'm sure that everyone here has seen that in your communities too, how everyone is supporting one another. So we think that that's really, you know, that gives us a sense of hope. Certainly, our police and firefighters are right there on the, you know, on the forefront of things, and so I think our response has been typical to probably the same response you're seeing in your community.
Yeah, and with respect to the police and fire, how do you feel they're coping, and you know, from a resources standpoint, do you feel like they have what they need? And that's not obviously meant to be a criticism of anybody. I'm just trying to figure out how we can best push resources into the community.
Well, I would have to say our police and fire are really very well trained and have been responding very well. Maybe I'll just ask our city manager if he would want to respond to that directly.
Sure. Senator Gonzalez, there would be two areas that would be of concern. One would be the personal protection equipment in terms of securing and being able to provide it to certainly our first responders. And although we've been okay up until this point, it has proven difficult and our supplies are running low. The other side I would point to, particularly on the fire response, is that the majority of their calls actually are medical runs. And with the low amount of personal protection equipment, we are starting to have to prioritize which calls we send them on and which ones we do not, so as to maximize their availability for emergency services.
And then are they getting infected right now as well? Have you seen outbreaks in the police and fire units yet?
This time, lucky enough, no, we have not had. We've had numbers of them had to be tested, and thankfully and luckily, we've had all negative tests come back.
That's great. Well, like I said, thank you, and I'll share your sentiment, Mayor. I think when we all look back on this 2-3 years from now, or whenever we get out of it, I think we're going to be really proud of our country. I really do. I think that by and large, the stories coming out of every community are incredibly inspiring, and I just want to thank you for your leadership. And encourage you to keep at it. And we're going to do everything we can at our level to make sure you have the resources you need. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you so much, Representative Gonzalez. Thanks for your partnership. And now, Representative Lujan, you have the floor for 4 minutes of questioning. I don't see your picture right now, but I'm hoping you're there. Oh, there you are.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Mayor Donker, do you expect that the financial impact of the COVID-19 crisis to state and local governments to be worse than the impact of the Great Recession in 2007, 8, and 9?
Well, I don't know how to compare it back to 2009. Let me just say, I think it certainly is going to be something that is going to be that we have to address for a long period of time. Not, you know, as we talk in the here and now, I think there's a lot of things that are going to come out of this that we might not have seen back then. That, you know, a city is an organism, and it's just not made up of the city, but it's made up of, you know, many nonprofits and who play an important role in the community. I think that we have a population, about 12% of the population here lives in poverty, and 23% are in the ALICE population. And, you know, the ALICE population, they're just one crisis away from moving into poverty. Well, I think you could call this a crisis. And so when you see that, and these are people who are hardworking people, who are, you know, working 2 jobs just trying to make ends meet. And we think, you know, the unemployment rate and how that impacts people, their spirits. You know, we know that, actually, I think Pine Rest, which is the 4th largest behavioral health organization in the country, showed that a study for every 1% increase in unemployment, you're going to see 1 to 1.3% increases in suicides. And that 32% of increases in suicide due to just job loss, stress-related, and loss of loved ones just for being in isolation. So I think we are seeing some huge impacts of this, and we're going to be seeing more into the future.
So there's some stats I want to share, Andy, and or Congressman Levin. According to the Center on Budget Policy and Priorities, by 2012, after the Great Recession, states had enacted tax hikes of about $100 billion and had to make dramatic cuts to public service. For example, more than 30 states cut public health spending, reducing benefits of eliminating health care coverage for hundreds of thousands of Americans. 40 states had to significantly cut higher education spending. This, of course, resulted in significant tuition increases and contributed to the student debt crisis. More than 34 states cut early childhood and K-12 spending, causing more than 250,000 teachers and workers to lose their jobs. State assistance to local governments fell by 5%, and overall, state and local governments cut 750,000 jobs in the aftermath of the Great Recession. So, Mr. Cormier, do you believe those cuts impacted your state and community's ability to serve and protect your community? The reason I'm asking these questions is just to try to get assessment of a comparison that was recent in time to encourage more investment from the federal government to local governments.
Yes. So speaking from a personal perspective, I can tell you I was elected in 1999. So I was there during the recession, and it did have an effect. We did not have to lay off anybody, but we did a hiring freeze. We gave no pay raises for probably 2 or 3 years. I think 3 years, none whatsoever. And we had to tighten up our budget. We got rid of some services that were not essential but were good for our community, but were not super essential. So we slashed back on that. And so, yeah, we felt the effect of it for not just a year or two either. It probably lasted about 4 years.
And Mr. Levin, I thank the witnesses and thank my colleagues for their time today, and do look forward to working on a bipartisan basis to get this funding in place. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Lujan. And now, Mr. Davis, you are up, and you're just keeping us all on our toes. You're in a new spot. You look great. You have the floor for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Andy, and thanks again to our witnesses. It's a really interesting conversation. And I think after this is over, I know many of us are sponsoring or co-sponsoring bills to have a look back at what went right, what went wrong. I agree with the mayor that we will look back on this and realize that we as a country, under the circumstances that none of us have faced, at least in my lifetime, we had to make some decisions. We learned a lot, and we moved forward with addressing our needs. But we can do better the next time a pandemic hits, and it won't be if, it's going to be when. And I think it's up to all of us to sit back in a bipartisan way and look at our failures. I mean, I've served in Congress 7.5 years. Some on this call have served longer, others have served less. We didn't prioritize a national stockpile of PPE, and that's a failure of both parties. It's a failure of all of us if the national stockpile was supposed to be used to deal with a shortfall in the event of a pandemic. So this is stretched out for decades, and this is something that I think we all have to come together, just like we are today, to talk about local and state funding, more localized funding. You know, after this is over, let's have this same type of bipartisanship to address what truly can we do to make sure that we don't get caught at any level of government in the same areas of deficiency that we've been caught during this pandemic. Now, there are obviously different areas that have been hit harder than others. I'm in a small rural community. I know many of my colleagues on this call represent more urban areas. But as a percentage, I know my hometown has been hit at a couple of senior centers where we've experienced multiple deaths. But we've been able to quarantine those senior centers. We've been able to make sure we get them the needed supplies and food. And then at the end of 14 days, they were off of quarantine. We didn't shut down the entire economy around them. So I want to ask each of you, number one, how long do you think it will take your community to get back to some sense of normalcy? Number two, what type of approach do you see in your areas as to getting us back to some type of economic activity within the areas you serve?
Well, I wish I knew exactly how long it's going to take. And I think that's one of the things that we definitely are having conversations about, and, you know, and what that's going to look like for us. Because, you know, certainly how we move into that is going to have you know, an impact on us. We certainly are seeing the impact, you know, of that would be created for us the revenue that the property, we're property tax, you know, city. So a lot of when our businesses are impacted, and if they're not able to open up after this, you know, so we will have loss of that revenue, plus the employees who live in our community who work for those, you know, businesses will see the loss of that. That, you know, those kinds of things are huge for us. You know, I said we save for rainy day funds, and one of the things that we had was we had back-to-back 100-year floods in 2016 and 2017. And we have $110 million of infrastructure investment that we need to make to protect our citizens from future floods. So we look at, wow, whatever, if we can't get our businesses back and up and running and help them get up and running, you know, those things are going to certainly be devastating for us down the road.
Thank you. Mr. Cormier?
Sure. And so, of course, I'm not going to speak just on behalf of Louisiana, but I don't even know if we know the impact just yet, Congressman, because we still have states, including mine, that a stay-at-home order. Our governor has asked everyone to stay home at least till the 15th of May. Some states and some cities are actually getting a little bit more restrictive in that. The city of New Orleans, I'll give you an example, a destination city, worldwide recognition. The mayor there said, which is known for outdoor events and big gatherings, the mayor there said, no more for 2020. We're not going to crank these things up till 2021. So we don't necessarily know the full impact of it yet. So to say how long it's going to take for us to recover, it's hard to tell you. But I would tell you every aspect of government, local government has their part to play in this. And in local government, from a parish or county perspective, we are heavily weighted on the health side, the human services side, and the local safety side. And those three things, when you just talked about how this is something that we never thought we'd see before, those three areas are areas that we've had to spend a tremendous amount of resources and time, because at the end of the day, the federal government or the state's not going to come in and help police these things or run our local hospitals. And so it's actually showed us that although we had maybe some reserves built in some areas where in the healthcare industry and local governments, those budget surpluses have been depleted down to nothing already, just in some 8 weeks time. And so it's going to be hard for us to determine how much longer we have to go. And that's all based on when these cities and counties and states can get back to, and I don't even know what normal looks like. I don't know what the new normal is going to be. We just went back into session today from a state perspective, and I just left the Capitol, and they have us all wearing masks and gloves, and I never thought I would see that day. But so it's just hard to answer that question.
Thank you, Mr. Cormier and Mr. Davis. Thank you.
I heard the Tibetan water jug.
Oh, good. All right.
I yield back nothing, Andy. I yield back nothing.
Okay. Mr. Malinowski, your turn for 4 minutes of questioning. You have the floor. And you got to unmute yourself.
There we go.
There you go.
Thank you, Andy.
Yeah.
And Rodney, I've got a bill on the national stockpile that we're going to send you, and hope we can work together on. So I wanted to start with you, Mayor Donker, and just to confirm, you have to balance your budget every year.
Yes.
Yeah, as does every town and county in the state of New Jersey, and in fact our state government as well. You mentioned that you furloughed, I think you said 128 employees, is that right?
Correct.
Can you say a little bit about what jobs those folks were doing?
Sure. I'm actually going to ask Mr. Cade if he can be more specific around that. I want to make sure you have the exact information.
So again, thank you. The jobs actually that were furloughed are across the board for us. Everything from our assessing department to our parks and recreation department, all the way down to our fleet management and our on-road collection services, such as heavy yard waste and refuse, not refuse, but yard waste collection. So a number of those. We were able, and fortunately we had the financial means and the ability not to lay off first responders. So our public services in the fire department and in the police department, in our waste collection, and in our water and sewer services did not have to be cut back. Almost every other department within the city did, however, experience cutbacks.
Yeah, those are still important jobs. I mean, people who make things run across the board. And I imagine if this continues, we have no idea where it's heading, how long it lasts, but you may have to face layoffs or cutbacks among first responders as well. So, and those 128 furloughed employees, how are they getting by right now?
Well, again,
what are they relying on?
Fortunately, obviously there was some provisions put in place with the first act that allowed for enhanced unemployment. And so some of those employees are able to be either made whole or at least close to made whole for a short period of time through that. We have also chosen to carry their healthcare services so they did not face the burden of potentially contracting this virus and not having healthcare coverage or having to pay for it themselves. But there are certainly a number of them that are suffering financial loss.
So let me stop you, because you mentioned the enhanced unemployment. Who's paying for that?
Certainly through the federal initiatives. And
there you go. So
as well.
So the point is, we're paying either way. And I think most of us, I hope all of us would agree that if the taxpayers are going to be helping those people through this crisis, we'd rather be keeping them on the job than paying them unemployment insurance. We'd rather having them be helping to provide services to the people of our towns than to be sitting on unemployment. That's exactly the philosophy that led us to pass the Paycheck Protection Program. We're going to be paying either way. So let's keep people productively employed, businesses whole, small towns whole. And then Mr. Cormier, we've heard our bill provides this assistance to any town of any size. And I'm just trying to think what the arguments against that might be. I guess one of them might be, well, let's just provide aid to our states and the states will take care of making the smaller towns whole. Do you think that's a valid argument? Should we be reassured by that?
It depends if you trust the state or not. I can tell you in my state, unfortunately, there's bipartisan politics get caught up in everything. We have a strong Democratic governor, but the legislature is made up of Republicans. The argument, this pandemic has affected every community, no matter what size, and that's why we have partnered up with the National League of Cities to be able to try to fight this fight together. Because it doesn't matter if you have a county of 4 million people or a small village of 550. Both those governments are affected in some kind of way because of shutdowns across the board. And in my case, our biggest county being in Louisiana, about 450,000, the smallest one being 6,000. But I can tell you, as the executive director of the association, I get just as many calls from that small parish than I do that, just as many as I do that big parish, because it's all relative. And so for it to channel down to the states and then us, I just think we would probably get a little lost in that. And so, that's just my take.
Got it.
Thank you, Mr. Cormier and Mr. Malinowski. Thanks for your questions. Now on to Mr. Neguse of Colorado for your questions. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. And again, thank you to all of our witnesses for your testimony. And it's certainly helpful and I think contextually just provides more of an evidentiary basis, I think, for us in terms of why this bill is so important and why it's so critical. I also want to take a minute to thank the National League of Cities who, worked with us very closely as we, prepared this legislation and ultimately introduced it several weeks ago. And because of their advocacy, you see a bill that had 4 co-sponsors to start with, myself, Mr. Malinowski, Mr. Levin, and our Assistant Speaker, Mr. Lujan, to now having roughly 150 almost. So, roughly 1/3 of the United States House of Representatives coming together on a bipartisan basis in agreement that this is something worth pursuing. So I thank you for that. I guess I have 2 questions, or well, I have one question. We'll see if I can get to my second. And just by way of background, one of the frustrations here in Colorado has been, much like New Jersey and some of the other states that have been referenced, Louisiana, most of the counties in our state do not have a population of over 500,000. So out of the 64 counties in Colorado, 59 have a population of less than 500,000. Only one city in our state has meets that population threshold in the CARES Act, which is the city and county of Denver. Major cities, Colorado Springs, Boulder, Fort Collins, Loveland, Grand Junction, and everywhere in between, do not. And I guess what I'm trying to understand, and perhaps our witnesses might have some thoughts on this and could expound, as to the sentiments of city officials as they grapple with some of the decisions that they are having to address with respect to the tough choices they are making, with furloughing employees and so forth, all of which has been discussed, in light of the fact that larger cities have in fact received this aid through the CARES Act. Just by way of example, I know my mayors have been very frustrated here in Colorado, where you'll have, for example, a county that has 510,000 people that receives $100 million from the CARES Act just as recently as last week, and yet an adjoining or adjacent county that has a population of 450,000 receives nothing from the federal government. I wonder how local officials like yourselves and many of your colleagues are sort of grappling with that inequity.
So in Michigan, the city of Detroit received money, and then we have 4 counties that received money. And someone asked me what I know about exactly the CARES Act, and I said, and I don't mean to be rude or disrespectful, but I said, well, I haven't had time to take a look at it because it really doesn't impact us, and we have a lot bigger fish to fry right now. And so it is upsetting, because we suffer from the exact same things that the larger communities suffer from, certainly on a basis that's, it's just all, how you want to take a look at it. But we suffer just as much as the bigger cities suffer. And I think that most mayors in the state of Michigan of communities less than 500,000 would say that.
And I would echo what the mayor said. As the executive director here in Louisiana, I'm also a member of a national association of executive directors, and I can tell you that we get together a couple of times a week on the phone, and that sentiment has been across the board. Although we're thankful for getting some federal funding to the bigger cities and counties because they got something, it's the neighboring counties and parishes, and even the smaller parishes that again, I'll say, are going through this same crisis, but receive none. And so I'll give you, for instance, we have 2 cities that are very large in my state. One of them was right on the brink of being, New Orleans was like 455,000 folks. So just missed out on funding. But the neighboring parish has about 400,000. So if New Orleans would have gotten funding and Jefferson Parish would not have gotten funding, they both feed off the same cycles. They both use the same healthcare system. It just didn't make a whole bunch of sense. And so I hear that over and over from my colleagues who do the same thing I do for your states. So at any rate, that's my take on it.
Well, it's very helpful. Thank you both again for your activism, your advocacy, and we're going to continue to push until we get this done and fix this issue, hopefully by getting our bill signed into law. With that, I yield back, Mr. Levin.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Neguse. And now I'll ask a question here. Let me put the timer on myself here to make sure I don't go over. So first of all, I just can't thank both of you enough. You've really done a tremendous job today. And I want to ask you about another element of our approach, which I don't think we've covered so much, and that is flexibility in the money that you would get in our, in the Coronavirus Community Relief Act. In the CARES Act, or the CARES 1, since we're hoping to pass CARES 2, the money that they gave to states and cities, larger cities and counties, was supposed to be for COVID-19 specific problems. And you weren't supposed to use it for revenue replacement, for lost revenue, and you weren't supposed to use it for things for what you'd already budgeted, which is kind of, I mean, of course you have a police budget, a fire budget, an EMT budget, you know, whatever. Or if you have a county hospital or a parish hospital, like you've mentioned, Mr. Cormier. So let's start with you, Mr. Cormier, and then Mayor Donker. Do you, on behalf of just your own self, you know, your government, but you know, your national organizations, have you, maybe this isn't an issue, but what have you thought about this question of the importance of, is it important that we give you more flexibility in these ways if we can get you this money, which is the whole point of this discussion this morning, this afternoon?
All right, well, I'll go ahead and start. Yes, I guess the short answer is yes, we would definitely need more flexibility. Keep in mind that the CARES Act funding that you sent to the states, also a portion of that money, a percentage of that money, depending upon how the governor and the legislature decided to break it off, could be used for COVID-19 expense-related funds as well. So in my state, the governor has told us that 45% of the $1.8 billion that he would receive would go towards local governments and the ability to be able to collect off of expenses related to COVID-19. But it's exactly what you said. If it was already a budgeted item, it's not eligible for reimbursement. And so we need some flexibility, because what we're feeling, again, we have some loss of revenue because businesses have basically shut down. So sales tax collections, and even I think the mayor said it best. She said property tax collections, we collect that as well. And I can tell you from personal testimony that I have some friends that will not make it through, who are in business in Louisiana, who will not make it through this pandemic. They have already decided that they are going to have to shut their doors. And so that same business that was paying property taxes is no longer going to be paying property taxes next year. And so we're going to feel that. But we got to have some flexibility in how we give this money. And I get the point where they talked about, in some cases, this money was going to be used to, you know, supplement retirement systems and all that. If you want to take away all that from us, I am definitely okay with that. The federal government has to put some strings on it, but they got to work with us, National League of Cities and National Association of Counties, to find that flexibility. And I'll let the mayor answer on her behalf.
Well, I think nobody knows their communities better on how the funds should be spent than the community itself. So I think that flexibility is really, you know, very critical, and it would be very helpful in this. So, I mean, if you just think about the things that we need to do that we weren't doing before, you know, again, with the, you know, technology changes that we need to make, and better video conferencing equipment, which we don't have. So those are all things that, you know, of course, we didn't budget for, that, you know, certainly wasn't a high priority for us, that we now need to be thinking about as we come into whatever the new normal, you know, whatever the new normal looks like. You know, if you think about schools themselves, the impact that they have, and the importance of, you know, one of the things that we are seeing is some of the gaps that we have as a community. And certainly with internet, high-speed, reliable internet, for us just to communicate now is sometimes very difficult. Midland is the 5th largest city by area in the state of Michigan. And, you know, and that doesn't include our county and how difficult that can be, you know, for them. Our kids in schools today are at home, and sometimes, and, you know, before, if you have no reliable internet, you would see kids in our libraries or in Taco Bell doing their homework, because that's where they could get internet connection. So now when we, so that's why that is so important to them, because it is setting our young people up for success in the future. If we are really having an impact, you know, those are things I think that we don't even begin to know, the things that we're going to see. I mean, how is this going to change our health plans? How is this going to change reinsurers for us on our, you know, on our workers' compensation and our, you know, property casualty? You know, I think we're going to be seeing, you know, having huge impacts with that. So any flexibility that we can be given that would allow us, you know, to make decisions for the things that are most, you know, high priorities to us would be incredibly helpful.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Mayor Donker. Thank you, Mr. Cormier. We went a few minutes over the hour, but I have found both of your testimonies so helpful. The questions from my colleagues were really terrific. And I want to thank everyone who took the time to be here today to learn more about this issue. You know, each of us is hearing from our own communities in our own districts, but I personally feel like it's just incredibly important for us to understand that this is a national problem, the problem of the crisis of our local governments that needs a national solution. And I look forward to working with everyone here to get our communities the help they need to stay strong. Thanks again, everyone, and stay safe. Take care.